So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good morning for people in Palo Alto in California on the West Coast. Good evening to the people perhaps joining us from Israel, the Middle East, maybe Europe. So, hello and welcome. I'm Or Rabinowitz. I'm a fellow with the Israel Studies program here at CDDRL's FSI. This was an exciting week for us. You're welcome to read more news about the exciting news that we have. It's on our website. Israel Insights webinar series includes a total of 8 webinars during the fall and winter quarters of this academic year. We saw a great response to some of our past webinars, and we are very pleased to continue with this important plank of our program, and we are looking forward to your engagement and to our future webinars. This current webinar will span about 75 minutes, and we have a very exciting, interesting guest, and I will introduce her momentarily. Just to kind of set the background for us, we will start with a conversation and then we'll open the floor to some of your questions. You can type them in the little screen. I'm sure everyone already knows exactly how to work Zoom, so we will be looking to your questions. We are also recording the webinar and it will be available for anyone to view on our YouTube channel. So if you're missing parts of it and you really want to know how our story ends, of course, check it out. And just to ensure you don't miss a webinar, please log on to our website and you can sign up to our mailing list. It's the little red icon next to the text that gives you information about who we are. So today we are delighted to host Ksenia Svetlova. It's going to take me a while to introduce her because she actually managed to accomplish so much, so bear with me. She's the executive director of ROPES, the Regional Organization for Peace, Economics and Security. She's also an associate fellow at the prestigious British think tank Chatham House, London. From 2015 to 2019, she served as a Knesset member representing the party then led by Tzipi Livni, Hamachaneh Hatzioni. If you know a little bit about Israel's politics, it was a very interesting, tumultuous time. Ksenia Svetlova speaks Hebrew, English, Russian, and Arabic. She's a former journalist who spent over 15 years covering the Arab world and Middle Eastern affairs for Israeli news media, international media, including the Israeli Channel 9, CNN, and BBC. She reported, and I think uniquely, and we can talk about it more, from Gaza, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, and Libya. She focuses on issues relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israeli-Arab relations, Russian influence in the Middle East, which is something we will talk about today, and regional and international relations of the Middle East. Today, we will focus our discussion on Israel and the multipolar world, lessons from Ukraine, Gaza, and beyond, and we'll try to tie these two really painful, but also very interesting, influential, and impactful conflicts, and we'll try to draw some lessons. So, Ksenia, thank you so much for joining us. I'm very excited to have this webinar with you. To kick off our discussion, I'd like to ask you, what do we need to know about what's going on the ground in the Russia-Ukraine conflict?
Thank you very much, Or, and indeed it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here with you today. We'll jump immediately into the water, and unfortunately, this day is no different from any other day in the Ukrainian war. Again, the Russian army struck today Ternopil. It's one of the Ukrainian cities, and it struck, of course, not the military base there, but a residential building with 10 casualties, civilian casualties, hundreds people, were hurt there and wounded. And this is just an ordinary day. It happens every day. It seems that since the beginning of this year, and specifically during the last 6 months, there is an increase in the viciousness of the attacks against the civilian, again, only civilian population. Mostly it's the civilian populations that is suffering there. And there is also some miniature, I would say, changes in the battlefront. There is a push in Donbass area around the city of Pokrovsk. The city itself doesn't exist anymore. It was leveled during the Russian attacks on it, so it doesn't exist as a city. It's just a geographical place now that the battle is going around it. And there might be a chance that the Russian troops will be able to conquer what is left, of this once populated cities. There was a population of 60,000. Many left, and unfortunately, some have caught and transferred to Russian territories, in Russian cities, not the Donbass area. So this is what is happening on the ground. But in general, to have this bottom line on, what is happening today, Russia, even 3.5 years since the beginning of the war, is unable to really make progress, to achieve its goals, to not only to conquer Kiev, the capital, but also to get what is left of the Donbass area that it put its hand on in 2014, and then more in the first month of the war. Now it's stuck for quite a long time, and the war of attrition is going on this front.
Thank you, Ksenia. So before we tie some of the different strings that we talked about between Russia and the Ukraine on the one hand, Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East on the other, can you tell us a little bit about how Putin is reacting to challenges internally and to some criticism? Before we opened our webinar, when you and me chatted, you mentioned that there's a bit of a crackdown going on. So if maybe you can shed some light on that before we continue.
Yeah, so obviously, the war is not going well, because you can lie to some people sometime, you cannot lie to everybody all the time. And since I think the end of 2022, it became very clear to those who follow closely the battlefield that the Russian army is ill-prepared, unprofessional, that its generals know nothing about the modern warfare, unlike the Ukrainians, by the way, and that it did every possible mistake along the way. So you do hear criticism in Russia rarely, but more and more so, actually, from the pro-war bloggers and pro-war journalists that cover the war and therefore know about the shortages of supplies, about the suffering of the soldiers, about the recruitment of those who are unfit for any kind of war, specifically this war. So in the recent month, there is a crackdown specifically not on those who criticize the war against Ukraine because it's unjust and unfair and bad for Russia, but actually on those who advocate for the war, who believe that Putin has to be more aggressive, to kill more people, and to perhaps, replace some of the cadre of the generals in order to achieve more in this war that he did so far. So you see how people who were quite important and famous figures, they were not only bloggers but also commentators on TV, are becoming either foreign agents, and they have to publish this embarrassing the revelation that they are foreign agents, or and they actually believe that they are patriots, or they, in some worst cases, they are being jailed and tortured.
So I can only imagine this was only heightened after the Prigozhin mutiny and Putin's heightened concern about any kind of criticism. So now, with your permission, I'd like us to roll our discussion a little bit forward. We're going to unpack it in the coming questions, but this is just to kick us off. Do you see a direct link between the two ongoing conflicts, right? We're here doing an Israel's webinar, an Israel Insights webinar, and we're talking about Russia and the Ukraine. So what kind of links, general links, specific links should we draw? For example, would a future US-Russia deal, forcing the Russians and the Ukrainian to somehow find mutual ground, impact the balance in the Middle East or something else? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, so it's an interesting anecdote. It, of course, doesn't bear any historical meaning. But when the massacres of 10/7 took place, many people noticed, people who are also following the Russian-Ukrainian sphere, that it happened on the birthday of Putin. He celebrated his birthday this day. And although, I personally did not believe in any of the conspiracy theories, and indeed they were not substantial, no evidence emerged so far about the direct linkage, for example, Russian involvement in, what happened in 10/7 and the preparation of Hamas troops and so on. Russia supports in some level, the legitimacy of Hamas and its government in Gaza Strip, but these are not deep ties. I did not expect that they would really put any money and effort, to prepare the cadre of those who were supposed to conquer the Israeli kibbutzim and and cities and so on. But while it happened on his birthday, I can just imagine that he looked at what was happening in the Middle East and he says, "Thank you, God. Thank you for this really genuine present." Because since that moment, when this most horrific attack happened, and then the most horrible war started with all of the atrocities that happened since so far, the world became less and less engaged and interested in what was happening in Ukraine. And you can hear from the ordinary Ukrainians almost every single day. So we see people protest for the Palestinians in the West, in the US, in Europe. What about us? What about what is happening at our end? And while you see quietly, some of the states, still trading, evading sanctions and engaging in this great trade, and so on. The war is going on. It's ongoing, and you have very little information about what is really happening in the occupied territories in Donbass. You have more information, of course, about what is happening in Ukraine itself. But nevertheless, the focus was completely switched to another arena. And this is, the biggest profit from, what was happening, because, well, for Putin, until then, he was scrutinized. Every single event, every single name was repeated time and again in all of the international media. It's no longer the case. And you do see, even in Europe itself, which of course is much more engaged than the US, Ukraine is the immediate neighbor, and Russia is a common threat to the whole continent. You see that, days can go by without any significant mentioning of what is happening in the battlefront and sanctions and the pounding of the Ukrainian cities and so on, So yeah, the focus is switched. This is, I think, the most direct connection. Putin perhaps felt that perhaps he can even get away completely. He was proved wrong. So, the sanctions were not removed and his situation did not increase significantly. And yet he still, is able to operate in this kind of gray area, further away from the public eye, I would say.
So before we talk a little bit about the parallels between the societies, I want to ask you, do you think, is it your perception that the Israeli leadership was surprised by Putin's reaction to October 7th, by his relatively pro-Hamas line?
Well, I think that perhaps those who know Putin well among the Israeli leadership were not surprised so much because they know that, he is Mr. Pragmatism and cynicism. So I don't think that those who really know him well, and there are quite a few people, not only Netanyahu, but also, for example, Minister Zeev Elkin, who used to be Netanyahu's private translator for a while, and maybe again now because he's in the government again. But I don't think that they actually, were caught by surprise. But the general public in Israel, yes, certainly. I think that, despite knowing that, the Hamas and Hezbollah delegations visit Moscow, and they're being well received there. There were embarrassing episodes a few years ago when Gadi Eisenkot, then, a senior member of the coalition and a minister, visited Moscow, and he didn't even leave yet. And the Hezbollah delegation landed, in the same airport and came to the same place to meet, Russian officials.
An unhappy coincidence.
Happy coincidence, exactly. The Russians, they're masters of that. Divide and rule and also be on top of things, show to everybody who is the boss. So I think for the Israeli public, it was quite a blow. Yeah, because Russia, from the very beginning, it did not denounce the atrocities until very late. I think it was like a few weeks into already the war. And then also it was very muted reaction in a way. And I think then, something maybe started to change in the public level in Israel because, everybody was with this barometer all the time of the, relations, so did they denounce? Did they pay us, a visit, like Biden did and the leaders of the EU? And Putin was receiving Hamas delegations at the time. So, I think for the public it was kind of a surprise, but not for those who really follow and understand that, Putin knows he cannot really win over Israel because of Israel's close relations with the United States. And despite Netanyahu's attempt to get closer to India and China and Russia, and his campaign and a league of his own that he did a few years ago with Putin's portrait, that was remarkable, I would say. This is putting it gently. Despite that, he can gain much more when he's speaking to the sentiment in the Arab street, in the Arab world, rather than just hugging Israel. There is no win in that. So from his pragmatic point of view, he was all about, let's talk about, the atrocities of the war in Gaza. Let's talk about Palestinians. Let's not pay too much attention to what happened on 10/7 in Israel.
Thank you, Ksenia. So we'll talk a little bit about Syria and Russia going on in our webinar, but first I wanted to ask you about the civilian parallels we can draw. So you mentioned the resilience of the Ukrainian public and the fact that they've basically been the target of really brutal and atrocious attacks by the Russian. Even today, I switched on the news and I heard of masses of Ukrainian civilian casualties in the recent bombing. And being you and me, we're both Israelis. We both follow Israeli news closely. We know perfectly well the similar struggle that the Israeli civilian society has been under in the past couple of years. And I think it's something that perhaps has been lost on the Western eye, the fact that the Israeli cities have been constantly bombarded with missiles and rockets for the past couple of years. So what are the parallels we can draw or that we should draw between the Ukrainian effort to maintain sovereignty and to make sure that the resilience of the public is somehow maintained, and Israel's struggle to make sure that the home front is as resilient? And I'm specifically thinking about Hezbollah, Iranian, the Houthis, etc. Do you think the two societies can teach anything to each other, can offer lessons?
Yeah. Well, one of the remarkable things that I heard during this war in Ukraine was.
Oh, Ksenia, we lost you. I apologize. Maybe can you please repeat the beginning of your answer? We are experiencing a little difficulty. We lost your audio. Ksenia
Okay,
will try.
let me see.
Yes, we are back. Thank you so much, Ksenia. I'm sure this is the Russian intelligence trying to undermine our webinar. Go ahead, Ksenia.
I hope that the sound is working well again. Okay.
Yes.
So one of the remarkable things that I heard from Ukrainians during this war, since 10/7, was that, first of all, they were very sympathetic to Israel because they were hit by the Iranian drones, and Israel was hit by the Iranian drones. And because, Putin was so cozy with Hamas and with all of the, this Houthi delegations and so on. But also, or they told me, friends of mine, they told me, listen, now we really understand how does it feel to live with the constant war. I mean, they don't have any hope now, I think, that the war will end. I mean, there can be ceasefire, but not really a peace. The word peace, which is so elusive in Israel, and people can ridicule you for using this word, and this is the word I personally use. I do hope that, me and my children and Palestinian children, we will live in peace one day, because if we will lose this hope, then, I think that part of us will be lost. But for the Ukrainians, I think this is kind of a similar feeling. We have an enemy who is not going anywhere. And even though he's not winning, but he can just, continue with this war of attrition for a very long time and also perhaps attack us in the future. This is the similarity. But I want to point out also the disparity. There is big disparity between the sides. Russia is a superpower, a nuclear superpower, with a huge army and endless amount of replacements, how it's to say it gently, for people he's losing on the battleground. Israel
A
is
virtual
dealing.
meat grinder, if you will.
Yes, the meat grinder is ongoing, and it's just unbelievable. That at the time, and I was a child during the war in Afghanistan, the very end of it. I don't remember much, but As a 12-year-old, I remember, that people were discussing the awful losses. And you know how many people were lost in this war? About 25,000. And, we are talking about hundreds of thousands right now in Russia, and it's still kind of acceptable. But still, it is a superpower. It is a huge state, territory, wise and so on. Israel is not being threatened by a superpower. Yes, there is a medium-sized power, Iran, and yes, there are a bunch of terrorist organizations that are very, persistent, and they will not raise the white flag, not Hamas and not anybody else. And this is a huge challenge, but I would not still compare it to the one that the Ukrainians experience. Israel would not lose its sovereignty over 10/7 or over the Hezbollah attacks or Houthis. But Ukrainians can lose basically everything. It's their sovereignty, their lives, any kind of hopes for any kind of future. Everything will be lost. So I think they indeed experience an existential threat. Israel, with all of the again, the circumstances that are horrific, and they didn't change as significantly, unfortunately, since 10/7, as we like to think. But we are not given under an existential threat.
So let's unpack this a little bit. You mentioned the role of great powers in these wars, in these ongoing crises. We're witnessing the reemergence of competing global narratives, if you will. And I would even argue that there's a shrinking space for neutrality. You're either pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine, right? And of course, you can take it to the Middle East as well. Russia's realignment with Iran and Hamas, which kind of resurfaced in this conflict, and China's cautious approach to both of these conflicts, by the way. And it has a very cautious and precocious approach to balancing its act over Russia and Ukraine. What lessons should we draw from it, or maybe even not lessons, maybe significant observations taking forward? And specifically, I'm thinking about the Russia-Iran partnership, the trends, the deepening trend since basically the second part of the invasion. I think people kind of forget that Crimea was invaded in 2014, and we keep talking about Russia invading Ukraine just a few years ago, and in fact, it's just the second wave of the same kind of challenge of Ukrainian sovereignty. So how do you think, what lessons should we as Israelis, you and me, we're Israelis, but our listeners and viewers are from America and elsewhere around the world. What are the lessons that Israel should draw from these two emerging camps and the Russia-Iran axis and Russia's general involvement in this area?
Well, I think that the first observation, and you're absolutely right, speaking about the beginning of the war, that happened in 2014, because when accidentally I forget it when I'm talking to Ukrainians and they tell me, no, the war doesn't last for 3 years. Sorry, it lasts now, it's almost 10 years. It's more than 10 years, 11 years now, and this is correct. I think that the very important principle that affects the whole of the international system was broken, that of territorial integrity, that it's sacred, and whatever problems you might have, with another power, you still will refrain, from something like attacking Kuwait, for example, yes, by army of Saddam Hussein, in an attempt not only to take some part, but to take everything, to end the, Kuwaiti independence in a way, So we did experience it since 1991. And then, when in the world, when everybody thought that, well, we are relatively safe. I mean, things can happen. 9/11 can happen. The 10/7 can happen, but still, so there is no threat for the existential threat, sovereignty. I think that, we were proved wrong by this Russian attempt, so they're being unsuccessful. But this is, again, due to resilience of the Ukrainians and also the support, hesitant in the beginning, but then quite steady, from Europe and the US. And I think that what we learned is that alliance of the democratic forces or pro-democracy forces is actually much stronger than any kind of alliance of non-democratic forces, because when you look at what do Russian allies actually do in this war, then, well, you see that, for example, the Iranians are competing for the gray tanker fleet with the Russians. the Chinese are squeezing Russia to get huge discounts on oil, on energy, to the level that, sometimes I'm wondering, I'm looking at the prices. Is it really worth to do the trade? Because, that's sometimes I think that it's, zero at best, the result, but maybe even less, so maybe there are even funding, some of this oil for the Chinese just to keep the work ongoing and so on. The same, I think, goes for the Russian support for Iran. The two countries really have a defense agreement. What else? What else could you wish for? But this agreement actually worth nothing. The Iranians learned the hard way that they cannot trust the Russians. The Russians, they blame them since the beginning that they are playing a double game. And they were right. They were right in this, because you saw how, for example, not the F-35, of course, the Su-35,
The support.
the Russian planes were promised to Iran, but not supplied till this very day. And there is a reason why, because this is the red line that shall it be crossed. This is the red line that you break with Israel. Not only, with other Western countries, but most importantly, also with Israel. Russia doesn't want this. It also, I think, fears Iranian increasing superiority, in the Caspian area, and so on. And there are many other issues. So if you're looking right now and going through the Iranian media, you would not feel that, they're treating Russia as an ally. Is a very bad ally, an ally that you really cannot trust. So I think that, and again, and there are, of course, legitimate complaints over the amount of help and, what is happening in the US, aid to Ukraine and so on. Nevertheless, I can evaluate the efficiency of this alliance as 10 times fold more successful than what the Russians have with either China, Belarus, and Iran.
So following up on this, would you assess that both Russia and Iran miscalculated the strength of the alliance, the strength of U.S. rejection of these kind of moves? So just a few days before Russia reinvaded Ukraine, you and me, we met in the TV studio of Channel 12 in Israel, or one of the channels, and you mentioned, well, one of the salient points you made was that Putin was drawing lessons from the US withdrawal from Afghanistan at that time. And I wonder, did these two actors draw the wrong lessons about US, what they presumed was US weakness, or the unwillingness of the US and the Western-led, the democratic-led powers and countries of the world to make a stand on these conflicts? How do you assess their reading of the situation?
Yeah, I think that there is something to it. There was a feeling, at least that's what they tried to broadcast, to the people at home and in the meetings of the Security Council and so on, that the West is rotten to its core. That's, what you hear from the Russians now, not only for the last 11 years, since 2014. You hear it, actually, I think since maybe 2007, 2008, since the war in Georgia. And I think that they were encouraged by the lack of response to invasion to Georgia. And they were encouraged also by, well, there was a little bit more blunt response, to the invasion to Donbass and Crimea. But nevertheless, still, I mean, there was trade going on with Georgia, with Germany, and they prepared to launch, this Nord Stream 2, and there were casual visits, and so that was okay. So I think that there was a feeling that, of course, there would be a rupture, but not to the degree of this in the beginning, at least, like almost total boycott of everything Russian, from ballet to any Russian produce, and so on, and the commercial companies that actually didn't have to join the boycott, but they did. Because they understood that that's the public set of mind, so they were surprised by that. Nevertheless, I think that even if that would be calculated, I think that still Putin wanted to wage this war. He needed it to consolidate the power even furthermore. He needed it to also inspire the public that already kind of lost its vigor since the acquisition of Crimea, since the occupation of Crimea. Because that was something that I remembered very well. That's something that inspired many people who said, well, like Ukraine, but finally, Crimea is getting back to where it belongs. And these were also some of the liberal Democrats, some of the current opposition, include Alexei Navalny, who had, not even ambivalent feelings about Crimea, but, he thought that, it should not be transferred just like a sandwich, he said. He should not be transferred like a sandwich here and there. So yeah, but time went by, and after this 8 years, I think that, he needed, this move for the sake of the army, for the sake of the security forces that, of course, get larger and richer and just increased to the enormous levels since then. And this is part of the reasons why he cannot end this war. Because, you have already war economics, you have people who are feeding from this. You have all of the people who you recruited and you are paying them tons of money, and you don't have this money, but you think, what will they do when they will get back from the battlefield? They were used to killing Ukrainians who were powerless and perhaps defenseless in the cities and so on. Now they're coming home. So you see already, more rapes, you see already more crime. But when thousands of them will just pour back, what then? I think this perspective really scares them. But yes, I think in the assessment of the West, they kind of convinced themselves or that, the West is no good anymore. Russia is this new vigorous power, along with the global South. And the West is it's old, it's powerless, it's toothless, and therefore even they will respond, it will be limited in time. I don't think that they expected something like this.
So let's turn our attention to a field that is perhaps extremely salient these days. We're talking about the information warfare, the battle of global legitimacy. You mentioned this when we discussed how the Ukrainians are basically disappointed with the loss of interest. Initially, when the war started, there was an outpouring of sympathy from around the world. And at a certain point, perhaps following October 7th and other conflicts, as global public opinion turned elsewhere, the Ukrainians basically lost some of their followings, if you will, and some of their backings and some of the sympathy. So we've been witnessing the emergence of kind of, I would perhaps label it as competing propaganda ecosystems, and I'd like to hear if you think this is the right labeling. Maybe we should tweak it a little bit, including, for example, the Russian RT network, and in the Middle East we see the Qatari Al Jazeera network, and we see other networks as well, and China is in a sphere of its own. And both when we consider these two conflicts, we see that in the Ukraine and Gaza, information warfare is central, and the battle for the narrative is central, and who gets to make sure that the numbers that they provide are the right numbers, the numbers cited by the media, the story told by other media outlets. So my question to you is, how do you think that these media narratives influence the question of legitimacy in international responses? And how should democracies adapt to the world where competing facts and competing ideologies are so prevalent in these, really competing propaganda ecosystems, if you will? Is it even important? Should we even care about what the Russians are saying in their own networks, for example, or Al
Well,
Jazeera, for that matter?
I definitely think that we should follow what they're saying. We do not necessarily, need to believe that, but it's important to see how are they building, this narrative. What is the goal? What do they say for internal consumption? What do they say to the outside consumption? Because if, for example, you compare the English language Al Jazeera and Arabic language Al Jazeera, there is a huge difference. They do not even resemble each other, and I watch Arabic Al Jazeera for many years, since it's enunciation since 1996. I was a student of the Middle East in Hebrew University, and I was in love, in the beginning, because it looked very professional, the most professional, I think, that you could get, at the time, certainly in the Middle East, but also in the world. They were like super professional. The visuals looked great, and but then you start to listen between the lines, and at the time they were bashing all of the Arab leaders, and they got them enormous popularity, because they went after Yasser Arafat for corruption and Hosni Mubarak of Egypt and everybody else. And these were like holy cows, so it was unexpected, it was fresh, it was new. And you know what? There was just one leader whom they never criticized, the Emir of Qatar. Not one word, not one word, surprisingly, and so on. So then, you get some kind of perspective when you listen to that. But you know what? Even before Al Jazeera, before, the RT, before the new media, I'm thinking about, the going to war against Iraq in the first war of Iraq in 1990, when Saddam invaded Kuwait. And there was this testimony of this young Kuwaiti girl who, among other details, she told a story about how Iraqi soldiers were taking out of incubators Kuwaiti children and they were just throwing them on the cold floor. So very soon, after that, there was this vote in Congress, and there was very narrow gap, but there was the majority for those who said yes, we have to go to war. And one of the factors was this specific testimony because it was so powerful. After some time, it was clear that this girl, first of all, she was a daughter of Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. And the story was never corroborated, by serious Kuwaiti sources, so that's you think, well, would the world look differently, if the story would not come to life? Yes, probably. So we have to be extra careful. We have to intercept, these lies. But more importantly, when we are looking about, at the coverage, for example, of the war in Israel, let's say, okay? So, Israel doesn't have its own Al Jazeera, so it has relatively decent media, and there are different opinions, of course, and, you can criticize Netanyahu and whatever. But at the same time, you also almost did not have any footage of, of the suffering, of the human suffering in Gaza. Okay, so, and then you say, why? Because there is abundance of that. Is it because we are always afraid that, it's a lie, it's fake news and so on? No, it couldn't be only about that, because you still can corroborate some issues. There is evidence. Our soldiers are there. You can check this. There are more serious media. Not everything is Al Jazeera. That was a cautious decision, made by this many channels, not to show it because we don't want to know. We actually don't want to know. So in Russian channels, I do not have any expectations, but of course they do not show any of the Ukrainian suffering. It just doesn't exist. Or it exists as, as a fake story. Look at, all of this fake footages that they show in BBC and American media. And then, of course, when you have the scandals around, for example, BBC and other media organizations, then it really helps. It really helps, this propaganda and so on, So I do think that as a journalist, as once a journalist, always a journalist, there is a huge responsibility for telling the story right. And journalists can be wrong sometimes. Everybody can be wrong. But if you are wrong one time in 100 times, then, this is something that you could have to do better. But in the end of the day, you are trying to get the real story to your readers and so on. If you get the story wrong 100 times out of 100 times, so 90 out of 100, then, you are trying to deceive your audience, and this is very different. So I think by now we know. We know about this. We know about, how lies are being spread in news media. What we need is legislation. In democratic states, what we need is the union of the, democracies in this regard and unified action on that. And we need to put an end to this, the disinformation feast, I would say, that is happening online and also on TV.
I think I'm just echoing what you said. As you were talking, I was thinking about one of the most shocking pieces of reports that came out earlier in the war, when us as Israelis, we still had some attention span to follow things outside the Middle East. When, and you mentioned this, that following the October 7th war, our attention span has considerably kind of narrowed itself. But I remember the Ukrainian security forces intercepted a phone conversation between a wife in Russia and her husband. I forget whether it was specifically in Bucha or one of the other villages or townships in Ukraine, where she basically tells him, it's okay if you rape. Go ahead and rape, my dear. Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And it was one of the more shocking reports I saw. And then came the reports of what was happening in Bucha and elsewhere. So, just to put everything you said in perspective. So I'd like to follow up with you. You hinted on Russia's involvement in the region and its position towards the Middle East. So I'd like to turn our attention to Syria. I know I fully realize this is something we can spend a whole semester on, not necessarily 5 minutes. So with apologies to the audience, this is going to be somewhat brief. But Syria has been a close ally of the Russians for decades, and the Russians propped up the Assad regime there, considerably so, following a certain point in the local civil war, and then everything changed. And it's easy to forget, but Ksenia, this happened only a year ago. For me personally, it feels like a century or two ago, maybe, but this was a year ago. So what should we understand about Russia's position to Syria, to the new regime? We saw the new leader, Shara, visit Moscow. We saw it visit Washington. What should we take? What are the Israeli insights to be taken from that, in your opinion?
So I recall 2015 and the official entry of Russia, into Syria. They were invited by President Assad. They were, of course, convinced to do that also by the Iranians, and I remember that the response in Israel was like, it's not that bad. I mean, because, there were at times there were battles between ISIS militants and Hezbollah militants and all kind of terrorist organizations in the Golan Heights. And there were there was concern that there will be a spillover. And finally, now we have like a superpower, this superpower that is actually, we have good relations with, and, it's maybe not that bad that they will be on our frontier. And there were also some hope attached to that perhaps Russia, out of its own interest, because it wants to dominate the Syrian sphere, will try to chase away the Iranians from there. My understanding, from what I knew then, I was at the Knesset, I was in the Committee for Foreign Affairs and Defense, was following it very closely. My take, these two countries worked together to safeguard Bashar Assad. They didn't work against each other. Okay, they had their disagreements, like they have on many issues. I mentioned Caspian, I mentioned oil. They're competitors on many fronts. But in Syria they work together. You had the lower level, the foot soldiers, the pro-Iranian militias, God forbid, not Iranians themselves, who fought on the ground against the rebels, the Sunni rebels, people like Ashara. And you had the Russian Air Force that pounded them from the air. But they work together, so any hope that, Israeli hope that, that can somehow change, I think that was naive to think that. And again, anybody who thinks that Russia is our friend, I mean, yes, tactically, we can cooperate here and there, but not more than that, so, and this is the situation also right now. So everything changed, but you know what? Not everything. Obviously, Russia could not safeguard its kind of leverage and its influence that it enjoyed during the years of Bashar Assad, since the beginning of the war. Because, I've personally been to Damascus. I've been there in 2006. And that was the time when the Syrians actually hoped to build some kind of relations with the US. And there were American delegations, and I think it was named Robert Ford. He was nominated as the ambassador. He never actually reached the embassy, the US embassy, but he was there. I didn't notice at the time that there was this huge Russian influence on Syria. The Syrians themselves definitely do not have any kind of warm feelings, towards the Russians. The younger ones definitely are more oriented towards the West and so on. But things turned a different way, with the Arab Spring, and, whatever happened. So now the Russians still have their bases in Syria. There are two bases, the naval base and the air base. Ashara did not demand from them to evacuate them. They evacuated by themselves most of the strategic weapons. It was a smart thing to do, probably. giving
Maybe
the
you
whole.
don't want jihadis to potentially
Yeah,
take over
yeah.
your
You don't
city.
know when, like people that who used to slaughter until very recently in Idlib would come and do things to you. But now the Syrian regime actually seeks to play this big power competition game. This was expected, I think, uh, correct, they have now the ear of Donald Trump, and they have the support from the Europeans and Arab countries and so on, and still they negotiate with Russia that Russian troops, the Russian military police, will patrol the areas in southern Syria, close to the border with Israel. Because in Syrian take, the Russians did many awful things to the Syrian people. They are not forgiven. Not everything is forgotten. But if they can be instrumental now to perhaps push Israelis a little bit further away, to the Golan Heights, to the Israeli Golan Heights, then justifies relations with Russia. And we see that there is also dependence in wheat. The Syria, if you think the situation there it's solid or stable, not at all. You see all of these promises of investments for billions of dollars, but at the same time there is a lack of wheat because they depended almost completely on Russian supplies, and the Russians just abruptly cut the supplies when the regime changed. So there is dependency in wheat, and there is dependency in security. Security, they need security. When they see that the Americans and the Israelis basically work together and they don't have any contradictions, not much, on the Israeli presence in the Golan, on the Syrian Golan, they feel that maybe they can use the Russians for that.
So you mentioned, Ksenia, that in Syria the public expects wheat and expects some stability, and perhaps this is something going forward that could destabilize the regime if they don't actually manage to supply it and to perform as the provider of these public goods. And it kind of makes me shift my focus to the Ukraine, and this is something we discussed in some of our chats before webinar. You mentioned that Ukraine is now plagued with or even I would say embroiled in a lot of public scandals concerning the behavior of some of the leadership and allegations of corruption. And this could be somewhat destabilizing, and it could also influence the way the war would go or Zelensky's own status. Can you say a little bit about that before we start wrapping up our webinar today?
So yeah, the first thing that I wanted to say, it's actually the connection that developed over years between Syrian rebels who now rule the country and Ukraine, because they had the common enemy that was Russia, and you could see pro-Ukrainian writings in Arabic and Ukrainian flags in Idlib, of all places, during the war, when the war started
Very
in Ukraine.
interesting.
There was this solid support, like these are our brothers and so on. And now it's possible to say with certainty. We suspected that, but now there are also there are proofs, intelligent proofs that the Ukrainians were actually involved in this war effort of Ahmed Ashara, Mohammed
They
Julani.
were training drone operators,
Yes.
flying
Yes,
drones.
drones and intelligence, and Ukrainians are hardened in these battles. They probably have, after Israel, the most experience right now in the world. I mean, not only in Europe. So this is something that Syrians take very, very close to their hearts. And there is cooperation, military cooperation and other cooperation between these countries. About stability and corruption, well, there is this perception because Ukraine is supported by democratic countries, US and Europe, that Ukraine is a democracy already. It's a functioning democracy. And well, it does has democratic characteristics, this is certain. At the same time, and I'm saying it with pain, but it's used to be one of the most corrupt countries before the beginning of the war. In 2014 and in 2022, so it did not perform well at all in this
So
spheres.
perhaps we were whitewashing it to believe it's a democracy, it's a standard democracy where we should be more critical.
I think that, it's always wise to be more critical and not to glorify anybody. You can definitely glorify the Ukrainian people who fought, very bravely and in the first few months almost with their bare hands. And, the steadfast is just formidable. But at the same time, I mean, even when the war will end, this problem will be very serious, and perhaps more even than now, because now the attention span is very short because of the war, and still Ukrainians are furious, because of this corruption case. I'm not even sure that, it's really hard to say, but Zelensky, who is still very, very popular, he's a popular leader. There were times that, there was this sense that perhaps he's like losing some of this popularity. But, I think that right now this scandal is really tremendously serious because, yes, many, especially young Ukrainians, they want a functioning democracy in their house. They don't have it yet. They want to be there. How do you get there? Definitely not with corrupt politicians and not with lenience to them, even if it's war.
So perhaps Gen Z will kind of change the picture and turn the table. You mentioned Zelensky, and I'm going to tie the following question, probably the last one for this section before we open it up. I'm going to tie it to Israel and to Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu. So I guess this was in the first year of the second phase of the war. Zelensky said something like, he said something that his vision was that Ukraine is going to be the Israel of Europe. After the war, he's probably talking about Ukrainian ability to be powerful, to deter, to be sovereign, to stand up on its own two legs. And I think something that is worth mentioning is that Volodymyr Zelensky, Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, and Claudia Sheinbaum from Mexico are the three Jewish leaders I can think of who are currently leading our state leaders. And putting Claudia Sheinbaum aside from Mexico, I think that drawing parallels between Zelensky and Netanyahu is interesting and relevant, not because specifically that they're Jewish leaders, but because of the two crises and wars that we talked about and their approach to public diplomacy. So, this is an open question, and feel free to take it where you think is interesting. How should we compare these two leaders? And their public engagement, their public diplomacy, what should they learn from each other, if at all? What lessons should they not learn from each other? Take it away.
Well, I think that if we are looking at the beginning of the war, then you have the ultra experienced Israeli leader who has been there for years, on and off, since the 90s, who just did this, afforded this terrible judgment that led to this horrific tragedy of 10/7. He basically allowed for these conditions to happen through his policy on Hamas, through the judicial so-called reform. Of course, people like me do not believe that it's a genuine reform. It's an attempt to take over the judiciary. And he created the circumstances for that to happen. And when it happened, he was distraught. He was nowhere to be found. He only spoke to Israeli people until very, very late, when people were just slaughtered in the kibbutzim and so on. I'm looking at Zelensky, an unexperienced leader, a young leader, without, all of these years of massive diplomatic and political career, beyond his shoulders. And you know what? I'm amazed. I'm amazed at his bravery. And amazed at his power and ability to rally the whole world, the whole, democratic world behind him. And it was also not a given. You could say, well, Biden offered to him, take a helicopter and get the fuck out of there, so what are you doing? And, you will be slaughtered or you would be captured by Russians. And he said, I'm not going anywhere. And he fought and he continues to fight. And yes, I do not glorify him or anybody else. There are, of course, shortcomings, and this corruption story is just one of many.
Perhaps we can glorify that one single decision to itself.
Yes. But I think that, this decision to stay where his people are and just to be there physically. And this is something that is very inspiring. I think that Ukrainian nation just made this huge leap at the same time in, growing from the infancy, from the post-Soviet period into something more. A nation at war that is fighting for its life, and it really has the leader that it deserves at the time. I think that Israel, unfortunately, did not have the leader that it deserves by 10/7.
So before I open it up to the Q&A, and I see in my little window that we already have two questions, and I would invite the participants to type in more questions if they have any. Ksenia, can you please point out the two scenarios where you think, two possible scenarios where you think the Ukraine-Russia war is going? Where can we see Ukraine in a couple of years? what's the best case scenario? What's the worst case scenario? How do you see this thing unfurling, if you will?
Well, this is such a difficult question. Like, this is really one of the most difficult. Since the beginning of the war, I'm constantly asked, so under what conditions this war can end, And I can tell you frankly that until now, for 3.5 years, almost four, I do not see the end game. Not yet. So I think that the best thing that can happen currently is just, to stop the war and to freeze the front. This is realistically, okay, because the best thing would be liberation of Crimea and Donbass and, the reunification of all parts of Ukraine, of course, and demilitarization of Russia. But we know that we're not living in the dreamland. So therefore, I think the best case scenario is for Russia to be that exhausted and that short of money and equipment and people that it would just have no other reason not to continue to fight, but just to freeze this front, to save what remains from its owner, and yes, and then just to wait for transition of power in Moscow. So I do not expect miracles there, not at all. But still, even within the system, as we saw, at communist era with Khrushchev, you still can expect some kind of change, and even if it's a slight change, it could be a great relief for Ukraine.
And this, I would imagine, also depends on the relationship between Trump and Putin, and we've been following it. It's a bit of an up and down and a lot of drama there, and something for us
I
to
know
look into.
I really have to add something about that, because
Please.
I think that it was the stubbornness of Putin that actually left no choice for Trump but supporting Ukraine in the end of the day, because I think that he indeed offered to him many different scenarios in which Putin could say, well, this is something that, I can start climbing down from the tree that I'm climbed on. I mean, he had this opportunity in the
It was his
Alaska.
to lose. It was his to miss, if you will. To
Yes,
a
yes, yes,
degree.
yes, and he completely missed it. I think out of arrogance, perhaps out of understanding also that he just cannot end this war. He cannot end it, So maybe if it will end by itself somehow, then there would be nothing to do. But he cannot end it, So for Trump, I think that a relationship that started with actually like smiles and attempts to do this direct diplomacy and encourage, it ended with fury and with slapping more sanctions, and we like receive more information every day now about more sanctions that in the end of the day, you know what, they do prove significant. No sanctions will ever collapse regime, certainly not in the first year or the second year or the third year, but it just, it can make you so tired, so weary, and, experience so much fatigue, war fatigue, that in the end of the day, you will be just forced to accept some kind of compromise.
Thank you, Ksenia. I'm now going to go to the questions that our friends and colleagues and viewers have typed in online. And I'll kick us off with a question by a friend and a colleague, Professor Gili Vardy. She's a military historian here at Stanford, and I think her question is very salient. Could you comment on North Korean troops in Ukraine? Are we witnessing some sort of a grand alliance coalition being created between Russia, Iran, North Korea, or China, or is this like a blip in the matrix?
Wow, yeah, thank you for this question. I think that it's really important because there was a lot of fear and suspicion of this North Korean invasion to the battlefront of in Ukraine, and the Ukrainians were very aware of this because there were a lot of myths and legends around the mighty North Korean soldiers. What they experienced, and there are some videos of captured North Koreans. They are thin, they don't know how to fight, they are ill-equipped, and they are in much worse condition than their Russian, friends and other troops that they fight with. And this is also the fate of all other foreign troops that are being recruited right now in the Middle East, by the way. Yes, you ask about the connection to the Middle East. Well, there is another connection. The Russians are now, they're recruiting also not only in North Korea. North Korea, it was the agreement with the regime, but they're actively recruiting in Iraq, in Egypt, in Algeria, and in other countries. But then, it's they just throw them into the meat grinder. And this
Wow.
was the story with North Korea as well. So, I feel that there was this, after all, North Korea is very dependent on China. They would not do it if they would not be perhaps ordered or advised, to do that from Beijing. And I think that was a gesture of, well, you asked for enforcement, take it, so we can,
Beggars can't be choosers.
sure, so yeah, that's what we can offer, but these are definitely not some elite forces that can turn the tide or anything like this. So the worst case scenario didn't happen. But then, of course, every additional person that goes and fights in this front, even if it's for the purpose of the meat grinder, it's still, it's a bad outcome. It's not favorable to Ukrainians that keep telling, our beef is not with North Korea. We don't want it to be with North Korea. It's the Russians who attack us. Please don't get in the middle of that. They are telling it also to anybody else who wants to go and fight for Russian army.
So now I will combine the last two questions from our chat, but before that I will entertain our viewers with the following anecdote. The North Koreans had actually sent fighter jets to fight Israel in the Israeli-Arab wars, and the Israeli Air Force reported that they were decent pilots, but still the Israeli Air Force won. So Google it if you want to read more about it. I'm now going to combine the last two questions. They fit in very nicely. Our colleague and the director of the new Israel Studies program named after the Kum Foundation, after Jan Kum and the Kum family here. We just got endowed this week and we're very grateful for that. Professor Amichai Magen wrote the following question. Ksenia, can you help us understand Israel's strategic posture towards Putin and Russia? Do Israelis view Russia as an enemy, as a hostile actor, a neutral actor, an ally? How can we shape, or how should we shape Israeli strategic thinking about that and the interaction with Russia? Excuse me, I'm very excited. And lastly, our viewer Aaron Rosenfeld adds the following question. Why is Israel not assisting Ukraine? He basically writes, Israel seems not to be materially supporting Ukraine significantly. Why? Why are the Israelis so fearful? And these two things play neatly to each other. So Ksenia, over to you, and feel free to wrap our webinar up with this answer.
So thank you very much for Professor Magan and our other listener for these two great questions, because it isn't a puzzle. It isn't a puzzle, even for people like me who follow all the time. But I can start with telling that Israel, the political establishment, and to some degree also the military establishment, they still live in a world where the Soviet Union is still going strong and powerful, and I'm saying Soviet Union and not Russia, because Soviet Union, of course, was much more mighty and capable than Russia since the 90s, and even during the 2000s, and of course today. So when you have exchange of opinions with people from the governance and the army, those who recently retired, I've listened time and again to very high-profile generals from our army without naming names, but I can tell you they are still caught in this illusion that Russia is still a mighty superpower, that it's better not to be in its hair. It's better to be in good terms with it, or else. So the explanation for the second question, why Israel, didn't help Ukraine as much as it could, especially in the beginning, when our help was crucial. I think that the official explanation was that we cannot afford it ourselves because we have Russian troops in the Golan Heights near us. We have the Russian troops about 70 kilometers from our border, and it can be very risky. And I thought it's bullshit personally. I thought that it's just like bullshit excuse because it was very clear that Russia being entangled in this war, that it proved to be much more difficult and much more disastrous for it than ever expected. Definitely will not go to war with Israel. It's quite safe to assume it. General Amos Yadlin said it, and many other Israeli commentators and experts said it, and I believe that, this is something that it's completely unrealistic, But again, if you're living in this world of these powerful images, then that's what you do. This is the first factor. The second factor is this, I think you can safely talk about personal fascination of Benjamin Netanyahu by Putin. So you see In all of their meetings that they had, and they had multiple meetings, he always used to talk about in such a superlatives about, I was given this honor, I was in Putin's dacha, and we had this amazing experience, me and my wife there, and so on. While Russia was already attacking Crimea and Donbass and all of that. And then I recall reading his biography, Netanyahu's biography, that it's called Bibi. This is his last biography that was published 8 or 9 months into the war with Ukraine. And there he described Putin as this extremely intelligent and bright and extremely, smart and just great person. This was his, feeling after this many meetings. And you feel that, there is, and again, it's not unique to Netanyahu. Some people are drawn to dictators. Some people are drawn to power. So you can also sometimes hear from the average Israelis who are not Netanyahu. I wish we could do to Palestinians, what Russian did to Chechens during the Chechen wars. Meaning, of course, the carpet bombings and so on. Well, it happened since then, but nevertheless, I think that it's this kind of fascination for endless power, unlimited power. In this regard, it was very clear that Israel, although being firmly in the pro-Western bloc and ally of the United States, and our biggest trade partner is Europe, of course, and so on. Nevertheless, it wanted to dance on these two weddings. It just didn't want to take a concrete step. And you saw ministers of foreign affairs going to Bucha and still unable to talk about the Russian complicity for the massacres. They were telling them like horrible things happened here. Who did them? We don't know. So and now when you don't have this excuse anymore of we are frightened by what Russians can do to us, in Syria and so on, you still have this kind of a continuation of the same policy. It might change when the American policy towards Russia will change again radically. So even more than today. Perhaps Israel will just follow through. But for now, it seems that it's also our political class is still also very mindful to not to differentiate between these two scenes, Middle East and Russia and Ukraine. It's kind of blurred. The lines are blurred. This is the theme of our webinar. These blurred lines, these similarities or disparities, these equations that are being constantly done. So Israelis equal themselves to Ukrainians, but also Palestinians. So I heard it from many Palestinian friends. Well, we feel that we are, because we are the David and you are the Goliath, like Russia and Ukraine. So so you can make all kind of comparisons here and so on. But in the end of the end, in the global world, or I don't think that you can really have this detachment between this political and military scenes anymore. So you will have this kind of fluidity going on, perhaps until there will be an end to this conflict, hopefully soon.
So, Ksenia, thank you so much for all this fascinating food for thought that you gave us. And I'll just tell our viewers that they're invited to follow us, the newly endowed Yankum Israel Studies Program at CDDRL, FSI, here at Stanford University. And please log on to see our future webinars. Ksenia, I hope we'll get to host you again in the coming years, weeks, and in interesting events, and we'll get to follow these events together. And let's hope that these two crises will find a peaceful end resolution soon.
Amen. Amen to that.
Thank you so much. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you. Bye-bye.